one of the things that people have always pointed to throughout all of history and time as we look back on the human species even is like we've identified that humans are unique because of their creative capacities. I mean, think about it. Birds, they can put sound into the airwaves, but they're not composing symphonies. Only humans are doing this like really thoughtful, expressive, contemplative, and creative kind of work. It's through creative acts in which we often will dignify ourselves as humans. And what I think is fascinating when you look at these early pages and look at these first chapters of Genesis and thinking, okay, he gave human beings these creative capacities. But what I think is fascinating is that he's given us like real agency. And we're not like faking it or just, he's just like, oh, I'm going to say that you're creative, but really what you do doesn't matter because I'm going to change it all anyways. Like, I don't know. What could you point to in Genesis 2 that would demonstrate that no, humans have real agency, that we're actually playing a real role in shaping the world? Is there anything that comes to mind for any of you?
And there, I think lots of us here at St. Marcus think the naming of the animals fits very well with that, with agency.
Ooh, yeah. Yeah, and that's a very like specific one. And I mean, let me pull that verse up. So thank you for going there. Think about like even just in verse 19, um, the that the human was called to name the animals, and then at the latter part there it says, and whatever the human calls a living creature, that was its name. I don't know if you ever slowed down and thought about like God is not like sitting over, Adam's shoulder, like saying, well, no, don't name it that one, name it this one. Or he is really like whatever the human called that creature, that was its name. Right there at the beginning of scripture, it demonstrates human beings have a real role to play in God's work and in history and how we've been given real responsibility because we're imaging God. We have a real way in which we have this authority, in which we can use these creative capacities that we have. And he, when I used to think about the Garden of Eden and the creation account, I used to think, okay, God made, this perfect garden. Everything was all done and completed. And then humans came into this perfect space and just completely, messed it all up or whatever. And I just think it's fascinating to think that, when God created this garden, and when God created the world, it wasn't complete. It wasn't finished. There were animals that didn't have names. There was a garden that he says you need to cultivate it. It needed cultivating. Like he actually invited us into something that we had a real role in participating in. Um, and and he's not done creating the world. He's still creating the world. That's an ongoing process. God is continuing to shape the world and it's manifest each and every day through all of us, and we're continuing to be invited onto the stage, almost like you've got jazz performers like, hey, come onto the stage and join me. Here's an instrument, I want you to play along. This song needs your participation. So I want to as we're talking about creativity, I do want to challenge this notion of thinking that maybe creativity is only limited to certain special gifted like select few of individuals, because really when we think about like how we're different as human beings and we're separate from the rest of the created order, our humanity, our unique role as image bearers is dignified through creative acts. And when we engage in creative activities, now there's a wide spectrum of creative activities, but I I think that's why we're so drawn to beauty and creative works, is because it's a way in which we can mimic God, but also, reflect his image and be the image bearers we were made to be, and to be able to take on that responsibility. So some of you might be familiar that Tolkien actually calls the human creativity, he actually uses a word sub creating. And I think that's a helpful way of thinking about the kind of creative work that we do. We're not doing capital C creative work. Only God can make something from nothing. He's the only one that can create ex nihilo. We are like masters of the remix. We take the things that God has laid out for us. We do have real agency, but we are kind of just taking the elements and then kind of putting our own unique spin on them, and then presenting them back out in the world. And so it's important for us to realize that there is a distinction between the kind of creative work that God does and then our own ways in which we reflect the ultimate, creative work that God does. And so I think this is a helpful way of us also framing it up. Now, when I hear, so sometimes I'll talk to people and I'll tell them that I'm an artist, and I don't know why, but sometimes just this confession of me being like an artist or an art teacher, sometimes people feel like they have to confess, like, oh, I'm not creative, and they'll say things like that really quickly, like, let me just get this out, out in front of you right away. I can't draw a stick figure. I'm not creative. And so I'll get these kinds of statements that people will tell me. And maybe even in this room, when I ask you to rank your own creative capacities, it's like, oh, we want to sometimes shy away from being, labeled as creative. But in all honesty, I do want to challenge this a little bit. Because if we see creative acts as a way of our humanity being dignified, if we are made in the image of God, creativity is not a talent. It's our birthright as human beings. It is the mark of God's divine stamp on our lives. And so this, I'll talk about why sometimes people, will make statements like this, but I would say actually this is theologically incorrect, because this is not truly what, to be human means that we are creative. Now, here's the thing. I think sometimes people will say this, and I just want to be generous, because I think what's really being said is sometimes we've heard creativity framed up in a very like narrow way, and so I think that's what people are getting at. I don't know if this kind of this is familiar to some of you guys. Sometimes the way of talking about the brain, you'll say, oh, I'm right brained, or I'm left brain. I'm right brain, so I'm really artsy and creative. And oh no, I'm left brain, I'm very logic minded, and things like that. So we've seen this kind of thing being thrown around. But of course, when we study the brain, we realize that actually this is not the way to think about creativity. And actually the article that maybe some of you guys read, that Newsweek article, it talked about when you are engaged in creative acts, it's not just like lighting up the right side of the brain. It lights up the whole brain. It's lighting up so many different parts of the brain whenever you're engaged in creative thought and generating ideas. And so this is something that everybody, whether you are more analytical and logical, or whether you're, really artistic and more about like expressive and things like that, like creativity is something that we all engage in with both sides of our brain. And so I do want to kind of clarify a few things when talking about creativity. And I think it's important because I think we should be, if creativity is a marker of our divine image, we need to be careful about, using terms that, or saying that, no, we're not creative, or no, we're not, just maybe talking about it in the wrong way. So first of all, creativity is not the same as drawing skills. Sometimes you'll find that a lot of artists, because it's a creative field, art class can be a way in which you can really develop your creative capacities. And a lot of times people that are natural, that have those inclinations, you do see this manifest in different skill sets. But in all honesty, I know I have worked with students. I've seen people that have incredible technical drawing skills, but actually really struggle when it comes to creativity.